So thank you, Celia. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for this. I'm honored to be part of a fantastic line of speakers. It's hard to follow up with Dory. He's hilarious. I really loved his talk, but I'll give it a shot here. So I'm Brian Allgeier, Director of User Experience at Insomniac Games, and I'm going to talk about how we transitioned to embracing accessibility. But first, a little bit about myself. I started working in the industry back in 1992. For Philips CDI. It was one of the first CDI-based consoles. Actually, a little bit of history here. Sony and Philips were working on a console together, but they didn't really have a good, partnership, so there was a splitting of ways, and so we know how that all went down. And then I joined Insomniac to work on Spyro Year of the Dragon, so I was a level designer on that. And then I became the game director on Ratchet & Clank, and I worked on 9 Ratchet & Clank since then. As a creative director and lead designer. And then I changed things up a little bit by working on a VR project called Edge of Nowhere, which was a H.P. Lovecraft horror type game. And I decided to change things up even more and focus on user research on Spider-Man. And for us, Spider-Man was obviously a huge success. It really just blew away all of our previous games in terms of sales and commercial success. And it was also our first game to embrace accessibility. And we had made something like 17, 18 games since Spider-Man, so that was a really big first for us. And I think we were just really kind of blown away by the positive response from fans, how they really appreciate. We had no idea there's this huge segment of people out there who really appreciated these settings. I mean, we knew about it, but it really hit us when the game came out and we started to see really positive feedback, and it was like one of the nice little good news stories of that week. So it's funny to think back in 2015 where accessibility wasn't really even on our radar. We did not even think about it or even discuss it. And it wasn't until we saw games like Last of Us or Uncharted where we started to look at accessibility features in a more serious manner. And actually, we have this AMA thing, Ask Me Anything, that we do every single day at Insomniac, where people send in a question asking our CEO about anything. And so one question was, are we exploring accessibility with regards to our own titles, specifically Spider-Man, but also future titles? And that was the point where we realized, absolutely, this is part of our culture, this is what we must do. And so we said, yep, and that was back in March of 2017. And then we kind of formulated a design document in October. We had an accessibility plan that we wanted to implement in April, which was soon after our March alpha deadline. And then in May, we started to get really concerned because the big focus was actually finishing the primary game, the base game. We were still working on combat. We were still doing lots of crazy balancing, tweaks, and tuning. And we realized that accessibility was not going to make it until our day 1 patch. And I think at this point, we all started to panic, and of course the mantra at the end of every game is don't break the build. And so everyone gets super conservative, they don't want to add any extra features, or that happens. And so the team, obviously this was the right thing to do, was to add accessibility, but people were there were some grave concerns, some major doubts. And usually the phrase that comes up at this point in the project when you're talking about new features is like, oh, we'll save it for the next game, or maybe we can just add like a small little sliver of it. So we started to get concerned, and this was the time to bring in some of the big guns, some people who could really, the advocates who could help us kind of push accessibility across that finish line. And one of them was Sam Thompson, who's a senior producer at Sony. And so it was great to have Sony as a publisher on our side advocating for accessibility. And I like to call Sam the Gandalf of accessibility because he kind of looks like Gandalf. And he essentially is a really wise guru in terms of the features that we could add. And so he really enlightened us in terms of the type of ways we could address the needs of the disability community. And one major one is just simply having good large text size so that games are readable. Another big thing is controller mapping, just being able to make it so that people can have options in terms of how they want to use the controls. This is primarily great for folks with motor issues. And then color blindness through design or through filters. It's better to incorporate color blindness options in the design, but filters is usually the option that most games go with. And then just having decent subtitles. And so that's a big one. And so many games get it wrong because they have titles that will blend in with the screen. And so having like backplating and stuff to make them stand out is a huge win. So Sam also just kind of enlightened us in terms of the different types of needs. There's permanent needs that I think most of us think of in terms of someone was born with a disability, or they had an illness or an accident. But there's also temporary needs. Imagine breaking your arm before one of your favorite games comes out. Wouldn't it be nice to still be able to play it? And then there's situational needs. And so I've heard a lot of parents talk about how they want to play their favorite game with their child sleeping in the next room or on their lap, and they'd like to be able to turn the sound down and be able to see all the closed captioning and information as they play. So Sam also directed us to an advocate, Josh Straub. I don't know if you've heard of Josh, but he's basically an expert, an advocate on gaming accessibility. He runs a website called, I think it's Daggers, and it focuses on reviewing games in terms of their accessibility features. And this is a great resource to kind of look at in terms of just seeing where games are making progress in terms of addressing needs of this community. He was also hugely influential in Uncharted 4 accessibility features. And so Josh came with his co-consultant, Josh Culp, who's to the left there. And they came by the studio, sat in the room, we had all the developers around, and they played through the game and would just call out various issues that they saw. And so this ranged from both motor issues, which is the issues that Josh faces, having cerebral palsy, but then also he would call out visual and auditory issues. And so here's him playing through the game, and Josh asked us to put the camera on his hands to show how he plays the game, where it's resting on a controller, and he uses his index fingers and thumbs to manipulate the controller. And so I think this was the moment where accessibility for us turned from an idea, from like, yeah, that's a good thing to do, to a, we really need to let Josh play this game. Because Josh is an awesome guy. He's a huge Marvel fan. He loves our games. And so that's where suddenly it became real. And this was the moment where we really started to embrace the idea of implementing it in our games. So suddenly, next thing, all of our features that we had talked about and the new ones that Josh gave us suddenly became underlined. And we focused on making sure QT tabs became holds, large subtitles, backplates for subtitles, speaker notation in terms of who's saying what. There was a skip puzzle option that we added, and then we had this HUD parallax, which was like this AR effect that we allowed people to disable because Josh pointed out that it could be very discomforting. So we implemented all these features, and our original plan was to try to test people of various needs. And so we thought, well, we'll find someone who has a motor issue, someone with auditory issues, someone with visual needs, and try to line these people up and have them play through the game and get some valuable feedback and do kind of a think aloud individual session. But it was actually very hard to find people in the LA community. We reached out to Able Gamers, which is a Washington, D.C. organization that's creating a database. But given how late we were in production, only weeks away from shipping for our day one patch, we were really struggling to find just the right players that could give us the right kind of feedback on a Saturday morning, maybe, you know? So it was kind of a moving target. And eventually we just landed on finding another advocate, Sam Schaffel, who works at Naughty Dog as a QA analyst. And Sam is actually a very big advocate as well. He's gone to many events talking about accessibility. He has limited use of his left hand, and he came by to sort of verify all of the features that we implemented. The big thing that he pointed out was that there's no controller map that was easy to find. He had to kind of was buried in the menus, and for him, who has to really be focused on how to use the controller, it's very helpful to see that feature up front. We actually didn't know where the controller map was ourselves. It was kind of an embarrassing moment. And then we asked the lead designer, and he said he didn't know where it was. So we realized this was more than just an accessibility. I mean, it's a usability, accessibility issue. And then we ended up putting that in the pause menu, which is something you basically need for a brawler type beat 'em up style superhero game. One thing that he really pointed out too was that the option menu descriptions, there's a lot of confusion in terms of what one was skipping. Like, oh, you can skip a puzzle, you can skip QuickTime events. It makes the game so much better. And it's like, well, am I skipping like core content? Am I skipping scenes? Like, I want to see Spider-Man do all the cool action stuff. So we just had to make sure that we were just very clear with our descriptions. And same thing went with QuickTime events. We had something where we said change repeated button taps to be hold, and so he would be playing and he'd be mashing the square button, thinking that, or he'd be holding the square button, thinking that it would do repeated button taps when Spider-Man was punching characters, and it wasn't. So we just had to be super clear in terms of our descriptions on what all this stuff meant. And one other thing too is that we had to think about specifying the default, because he would load up the accessibility menu, start making a bunch of changes, and then go, oh, I wonder what was the default, what was the intention of the developers. And so that was something that was pretty obvious, but we had neglected to do. And then with our menu as well, we made sure that the language was consistent so that when you first opened it up, they were all set to off. We used to have disable parallaxing was enable parallaxing, so that would be on, but then others would be off. So we figured out a way to make it more consistent. So that was kind of like our Hail Mary last, bit of testing before we basically wrapped up the game and shipped it in September. Later on in February of 2019, Josh Straub presented us with the Daggers Award for breaking barriers on Spider-Man, which was a really nice gesture of him. It was it was really nice to see a AAA game embracing accessibility, and so that's what he wanted to recognize. So, we're done, right? We made our game accessible. Yay, we figured it all out. Of course, there was tons of stuff that we wished we could have put in the game that we never did. And so I think that's part of why we were really pleasantly surprised by the news stories, because we felt like we kind of missed the mark. But it turns out that the disabled community is such an underserved community that they really embraced it. And we wish we could certainly do more, and we're planning on doing more. And so we didn't address dual button presses. Playing Spider-Man is like playing a musical instrument. It's like you're pressing multiple buttons at the same time. It's like they're like button chords. And we didn't have any optional controller layouts because the way we coded it, we had a lot of hardwired buttons and icons that wasn't easy just to change on the fly. So we couldn't even do a simple left-right flip, which is a huge benefit for people who have issues on one side or the other. One thing that surprised me was we couldn't implement mono audio. I asked about a month before the game shipped if that was an easy thing to turn on, and it wasn't, based on how we did all our audio processing. And we didn't have any color blindness filters. So all of this could have been addressed much earlier and probably would have been easier to implement. So the biggest regret was that we didn't address chases. And so there's a number of chases throughout the game that if you have any kind of motor needs or visual needs, you're going to really struggle and have a difficult time to kind of follow the target. And we didn't have any like simple rubber banding, global variable that we could just adjust. And it's because every single chase was scripted in a unique way, and so it wasn't so simple to fix. And again, so this was something that we could have addressed early on. So after we shipped Spider-Man, we wanted to just continue momentum across the company. Insomniac's roughly 300 people. There's 250 people in our Los Angeles office and 50 people in our Durham office. And so we were thinking like, okay, we have a small group of people who sat in the room with Josh, who enjoyed, seeing him play and understanding the various needs that we could be addressing. How do we get more people involved? And so there was an opportunity that came up where there was an LA Abilities Expo that happened in Los Angeles, which focuses on products for the disability community. And Sony actually had a booth there featuring Spider-Man, and so this was an opportunity for us to invite Insomniacs to the booth, have them actually meet the players firsthand, walk them through the game. And so there's a lot of really heartwarming stories that occurred as they met with people. We had some people who were like, I don't play video games, I'm sorry, it looks great, but I can't do it. And after a little bit of coaxing, they would go up and swing through the city, fight the first boss, and just have a huge smile on their face the entire time. One player actually ordered a PlayStation Pro and a copy of Spider-Man on site because her child was having so much fun. So that was really great to see. So at the same time, Sony was gathering names for a recruitment database so we could find more people in the Los Angeles area so we wouldn't run into the same situation that we had when we were looking for players for Spider-Man. The other big surprise was that there are occupational therapists who were visiting the show. And these are people that work with people with disabilities. They typically work at hospitals. I don't know if they're called the same thing in France or other countries, but they really just help people live meaningful lives. They help them with basic things like eating or other things that they need to do if they've suffered an accident and are relearning how to walk or eat. But they have a huge network of people that they work with. They're probably, a lot of them are gamers themselves. So this is something we want to look into tapping for future projects. So one thing that was really nice to see is as we started to get more internal advocates, we started having started having Insomniacs develop these Confluence pages and web pages to try to educate all the other departments on how to make our games more accessible. And so this was just really cool to see this Confluence page that one of our character artists put together on how to filter different screens and educate people on the different color blindness filters, and how we can evaluate high contrast and all of our visuals. So as we started talking more about accessibility, people started to speak up and share about their spouses and partners, their friends, fellow game developers, and one person actually kind of met all of this criteria. His name is Jason Bolte, and he is the partner of our VFX lead, Brianna Lindsay. And Jason has RP syndrome, which is retinitis pigmentosa, and he's losing the center of his vision and as well as the outside of his vision. And he's actually a game developer, a veteran, and worked at ZeniMax Studios for, well, he worked in the games industry for 10 years. And he's at Disneyland here using this accessibility device. So we thought, you know, wouldn't it be great to invite Jason to the studio, have him share his experience, and try to get more people on board. So we essentially put together a presentation. We showed it to all 50, 60 leads at the company and convinced them that we needed to make a big day event out of this. And so we had a company event where we just focused on accessibility. And we invited all 300 Insomniacs to this company meeting and essentially walked them through a presentation. And so here I am at the company presentation. And the one thing that I shared with everyone is that there are some new laws going into effect. There's a law that went into effect just this year, which was the CVAA, and that's an updated law in the United States for communications between people. So this can mean anything from real-time mobile communication to games, and it mainly applies to multiplayer games. And the one big example that came out earlier this year was Apex Legends, which had this cool chat wheel, and you could actually select these pre-recorded lines and communicate with other players. And so this was very helpful for people with speech issues. So I essentially, said that this is something that was on the horizon. It's a growing, moving trend. It's something that we need to be very cognizant of, and we have to start thinking about it for future games. But then the thing that I also did was I just reiterated that was all part of our vision statement. And Insomniac's vision is to create games that have a positive and lasting influence on people's lives. And it also was integrated into our mission statement, which was to inspire players with stories of underdogs overcoming colossal challenges. And so these screens are actually displayed in our kitchen every single day as we walk through the office. And so it was really nice to be able to bring these up and reinforce the reason why we want to promote accessibility. So then also the mission is to challenge and inspire each other within our collaborative culture, and to help the less fortunate by supporting worthwhile causes. And so we donate money to a charity called the Starlight Foundation that we've been doing for the last 10 years, and they supply video games and consoles to children in hospitals. And then also we want to be the leaders in the game development community. And so, I mean, I am sort of, it's an easy sell when we embrace these kind of values, but I really wanted to hit home hard. I really wanted people to just feel it in their bones that accessibility was something we really needed to support. So then we brought Jason Bolte up on stage, and Jason gave this really wonderful talk where he asked this fundamental question, which was, can I play too? And he posed the question because in a lot of media, whether it be books, movies, or TV, or games, for many of them, the answer is yes, he can play too, he can engage. He goes to the movie theater where he gets headphones and he can actually listen to narration of the film while he sits there with his partner and watches it. In books, of course, there's Braille, there's screen readers that he can benefit from. But with games, it's always a maybe. He's not sure if he'll be able to actually finish the game when he buys it. So we asked him to play through Spider-Man, and he actually had already played through it. And he came to talk about what his experience was like. And he sort of created this mock-up image, which is where he's losing his vision. And it's essentially like losing pixels in the center of the screen. Excuse me. And then he showed, this was part of his presentation where he talked about the Fisk, which is like the Kingpin boss fight. And this is how it's normally seen. Excuse me. And you can pick out Wilson Fisk, which is the bald guy, that's the main boss there. And you'll notice he kind of blends in with the other enemies, and he's actually really hard to pick out. This was actually a usability issue that we never addressed during our testing. So this is, of course, Jason, how he sees the game, and he uses his peripheral vision to try to track objects. And so it's even harder now to track down Wilson Fisk and see where he is in the fight. So Jason, given his background and expertise in design, pointed out the importance of size, shape, texture, intensity, and color, and how you have to use many different methods to communicate features in a game, and how you can't just rely solely on one. And again, this is just good UX, and that was something that he was reinforcing throughout his talk to the team. One of his favorite challenges was called the Black Cat Challenges, where you have to do like a Where's Waldo type thing, where you're searching the city looking for a small cat. And going back to my teenage years here. He enjoyed it. He could actually find every cat. And I thought this was rather ironic for someone who struggles with this visual disability, that he could do it. But the controller vibrates every time you're close to the cat. And so he solved all 30 of them, and he liked feeling this empowerment of being able to find all these cats. So that was another example of another way of communicating feedback through the vibration of the controller. It was a small thing for us to add, but a big win in terms of accessibility. So this kind of brought me back to Apex Legends, and the first time I had heard about the feature with the whole chat wheel wasn't because of it making accessible for people with speech issues, but actually people brought it up because they felt like it was a safe space where they could play. They didn't have to worry about age, gender identification, or their cultural background to invite any kind of gamer toxicity. So that was just kind of the thing that was reinforced throughout, was that by making our games more accessible, we're just improving the games in terms of the UX and improving the design. So I ended the talk just sharing with the whole studio that all of us are getting older, that we're all going to at some point in our lives most likely face accessibility issues. I know myself, in the last 6 months, I've become the guy at the restaurant who holds the menu like this and has to kind of squint to see the text. So I would definitely benefit from larger text in games. Ultimately, it really hits home for all of us at some point. So even though, again, as I said before, it was an easy sell to Insomniac, I really wanted to just break down why it was important to us. And it aligns with the company goals. It's forward-thinking. Just as media progresses, there's going to be more laws put into effect where it's going to be important that we have accessibility. Great accessibility is great UX. And everybody will benefit from this. And so even if you're the most jaded person, you're reaching a wider audience ultimately, and you're making better games. So how do we embrace accessibility on a day-to-day basis? Well, we emphasized during the talk that accessibility is a team effort. There's such a wide range of accessibility needs, it's hard to know where to start or how to meet them, but the more educated every team member becomes, the more we can ask ourselves, how can I contribute, how can I help improve this feature and make it more accessible? And also just keeping it top of mind. We have our group of advocates, we meet on a monthly basis, and we all share either recent games that have some great accessibility options or what opportunities we see to improve for our own games. And essentially, we have also a Slack IM list, an email list, and all that, just so that we can continue to get emails and reminders about accessibility. And the other thing that we want to focus on is just seeing how much we can incorporate accessible features into our design and not necessarily always rely on settings or options menus. Like, what if we would have proposed that Wilson Fisk was wearing a white suit or the enemies were wearing a different color and that was just part of the base game? We want to see where we can make improvements as the foundation before we start adding the settings. And then just as noted before, starting early in the production cycle, bringing in the advocates, having them play through the game, potentially bringing in those, I'm just drawing a complete blank here. I can't believe I just forgot the whole name of that. The people that work at hospitals, occupational therapists, that's it, okay. Wow, all right. So bring them in early so they can essentially check out the game and give feedback. And then our goal is to build off of each game. So we take all of the information, all of the option settings, we put it in a Confluence page and we make sure that we carry that forward. Spider-Man was essentially phase 1 for us, but all future games will be phase 2 and phase 3, and we'll just keep building off of what we've created before. And so ultimately, accessibility for us is not just about adding new features for our games, but it's truly embracing it as a culture. And that is all. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. So we do have questions on there. A lot. We're not going to be able to answer them all. So none of these questions are upvoted. So we're just going to pick one. I don't know which one to pick. It's hard. There's more, even more. Okay. So do you have more examples of really good feature that enhance accessibility in a game, like the chat wheel in Apex?
Yeah, I think there's some minor stuff. They're very low cost. They're not like a big feature like the chat wheel. A good example is in Gears 5. You know how when you play through Gears and combat's over with and there's like the music kind of has a little stinger at the end to let you know that you've beaten everyone? Well, for people who don't hear that, they don't know that combat's over. And so they just added a very simple line in the subtitles saying combat music ends or something to that effect. And so that's a really nice feature that I think is very easy to add, but is a big win.
Is there any other question that you want to just like one last? Just pick the one you want.
Sure.
Then we can have a quick break.
So I guess there's a question here. How far can we allow the player to skip challenges into making the game accessible? So it's interesting because, and this kind of relates to another question about cognitive issues. So for our puzzles, we decided to make all of them skippable, and some of it was for fine motor control issues, but we also realized that there was some probably cognitive issues. And there's some people who just don't like puzzles, you know, and they don't want to bother with them. And we've been going back and forth on this. Like Sam Thompson says that we should never have a skip option, or he kind of posed that question because the concern is that that's an easy cop-out or an easy fallback. It's like, oh, we'll just add skip to the whole game. You can just like skip through it. And obviously people are playing games for a reason. They want to be challenged. They want to enjoy the experience, the thrill of being Spider-Man. So we do want to try to address all the needs as we can and give people the full experience, but we also realize that there will be times where we need to include the skip option. But that shouldn't be our first go-to plan.
Sweet. All right, we're gonna stop now. Thank you so much, Brian.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone.